Hello, Midwestern Marx listeners and viewers. We have a very special episode of the podcast today. We are speaking with Yugopnik, a comrade and a fellow YouTube creator. We've been trying to schedule this for a while. We live in different parts of the world, so it's been difficult to get the timing correct. But we're finally sitting down here to have a little conversation about socialism and Marxism. So how are you doing today, Yugopnik?
Hey, it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I have always been a fan of your content, and I've been watching you since pretty much, you started. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm doing pretty well. Obviously, the time zones are a tricky thing, especially because we're literally on the polar opposite sides of the planet. But we managed to figure it out somehow. So yeah, I think this should be fun.
For sure. Yeah, so I wanted to start the conversation. You recently published a video that I thought was really cool about how to survive under capitalism as a socialist or communist. And it was kind of tailored to surviving in our current stage of capitalism, 21st century capitalism. Obviously, a lot of giant tech companies and giant tech conglomerates are consolidating more and more power. And it's changing kind of what the world looks like a little bit. So what do you see as a major difference in modern capitalism compared to the capitalism of the last century, or maybe the differences in Fordist capitalism or the industrial kind of capitalism that Marx was looking at, and what we have today, which is still capitalism, but neoliberal capitalism, as I said, a lot more focus on tech companies consolidating their power and control, at least here in the West. So yeah, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think an important thing that everybody should touch on when they compare the different stages through which capitalism has developed is how much capitalism has actually contributed to certain positive or negative aspects in that given period. What am I trying to say? So if we're looking at the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, the industrial boom, standards rising like crazy, especially in the West, people learning about newer and newer types of material goods that they can consume, some people being able to buy a house, have a lawn in front of the house, buy their first car, buy their second car, et cetera, et cetera. Those were all periods of capitalism in which there was something new that capitalism could offer the everyday consumer and the everyday person, something that can actually be brought forward, which will directly or indirectly increase their standards or not. We have reached, what people like to call late stage capitalism at this point, where quite literally everything that capitalism is doing is repackaging the absolutely same products that it has been selling us up until this point, and repackaging them in a way to tell us that your identity, my identity, our listeners' identity is directly linked to consuming said product. So yes, the main sort of thing that we are kind of driving towards is not consumption for consumption's sake, but quite literally living to consume and living to identifying through the way that we interact with the system, which at the end of the day is continuous, material gain to one extent, and complete lack of access to material gain on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. So that's what I kind of touch on in the video, where I introduced this very simple concept that as socialists who understand that this system is corrupt, crooked, and absolutely does not work, and as people who understand that we as the working class will never be treated fairly by, be it our employer, our governments, or our direct, different societal structures in which we exist. And I introduce this sort of call to action in which I say, you know what, if they're fucking us, we're gonna fuck them back to an extent which should in a way help us increase our own personal standards while existing in the system. So at the end of the day, yes, it's a 25-minute video, but it pretty much says there is, no ethical way to exist in capitalism. So if you can screw over your boss, your employer, or whoever in order to get your life a bit more straightened out, then fucking do it,
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I noticed something similar with neoliberalism. Marx talks extensively about how the mode of production can only change to a new mode of production when the technology is available to do so, and when the means of production have improved themselves and increased to the point that makes the previous property relations no longer make sense, and move to new property relations to be the only way to continue moving forward and continue making advancements in production. And right now, under neoliberalism in the West, the technical our technical ability to produce is massive. And as Paul Cockshott has laid out, and as Hakeem has laid out, companies like Walmart have kind of developed on their own the technology needed to centrally plan an economy. So it's almost like we've hit this stage of neoliberalism or of capitalism, where we're no longer actually advancing the productive forces. We're no longer clearly advancing society as we were under Fordist capitalism, like you were explaining. And it's now, as you said, they're just repackaging new things, and there's an increase in consumerism. And, there was a study done, and people in the West, despite the fact that everyone works over 40 hours a week, the average person only spends 12.5 hours working, because there's not that much to be done. So while you have this proletarian class of blue collar workers who are taking on these horrible jobs, or not horrible jobs, but really labor intensive jobs in areas like concrete or blue collar industries, agriculture, and then there's an entire class of people in this sort of managerial class who don't have as much work to do. And it's almost like our productive forces have increased to a level where we need to move on to new property relations. Obviously, it's different for countries in the global South who have an industrialized agriculture, and obviously imperialism has played a role in holding the productive forces in the global South and stopping them from increasing themselves. But at least in the West, as you said, the onus is on the working class to have an uprising against this capitalist bourgeoisie, this oligarchy, who's actually now preventing us from moving forward and preventing us from designing productive forces that are going to combat the climate crisis while improving the conditions of the proletariat. And for me, like you said, the only way to move past that is for the working class to realize, we are getting fucked, and the only way to not get fucked is to fuck these guys, to take the capitalist class, who's been using the productive forces only to increase consumerism and only to increase their own profit, in creating equal misery for the working masses of society. And to take them out of power and replace the state with a worker state. And obviously this is kind of the old thesis of Marx, but that's kind of my point, is like the current stage of neoliberalism, the current stage or late stage capitalism that we have is different from Fordist capitalism, but it still stems from those same relations that Marx analyzed in Capital, in the fact that capital in the productive process has complete domination over labor. So they've allowed society to grow into this consumerist kind of what we've been talking about here, where the productive forces are through the roof, but the working classes who actually put their labor into advancing those productive forces have very little access to the means of subsistence. And then, there's just an increase in consumerism, an increase in the advertising we're bombarded with to try and sell us crap to maintain these extremely high profits. Cost of living and things like rent are shooting through the roof. And yeah, I mean, the only option or the only way to stop that is the same thing it was in the 1800s when Marx was writing, is for the working class to overthrow these corrupt parasites who are currently in power.
Exactly. I could not agree more. I mean, it's come to this point, which is so ridiculous that pretty much the main argument that capitalists are giving us for why the system is so glorious and so beautiful, because, material wealth will increase because of competition in the free market, etc., etc. Excuse me, but nobody even owns shit anymore. People are even buying their phones through a loan. People are buying their computers through a loan. I'm not even talking about houses or cars. People are buying food through fucking loans. At this point, absolutely nobody can afford almost anything. And it's to such an extent that not even only the proletariat, but even the bourgeoisie who owns, businesses, owns companies, and in certain cases, corporations, has to enter into a loan relationship with banks in order to survive this constant constant necessity for capital growth and for increased profitability. I mean, every single aspect of what is supposed to be so brilliant about this system is absolutely falling lower and lower. And nobody seems to really even notice or give a fuck, except for specifically, socialists, Marxists, communists, whatever you want to call it. To one regard, that's that shows that still the Marxist analysis of the world is the most based in solid material scientific truth compared to pretty much all other types of answers towards how the system is run today, like degrowth and like let's all just be vegans, or the hippie movement in the 70s and 60s. All of those movements started and died off, but Marxism in general as an idea is the only thing that offers true criticism of the system, and therefore offers true solutions to where this system can go, and where this the point at which the system can be obviously overthrown and replaced with something else. So as compared to capitalism in the 60s, 70s, 50s, and even the bloody 30s, right? And if we're talking about the West, though, we can talk globally as well. At least capitalism was delivering on something, right? Nowadays, it's not delivering on shit. And to a very large extent, as I previously said, to the proletariat. But funny enough, it's starting to even fuck the petit bourgeois, which is quite literally getting proletarianized and eaten up by massive corporations, like used Walmart as an excellent example. But we can drive this conversation towards something very interesting that you said about giant corporations starting to use centralized planning inside of their superstructure, corporate superstructure, and how it's extremely efficient and how it works really well. I mean, this drives the point that Marx said, they're going to sell, the capitalists are going to sell you the rope you will hang them with, quite literally, because Amazon, Walmart, et cetera, quite literally creating systems which can at one point quite literally be used by the proletariat to govern itself afterwards. And I think it's just mother of irony how from one side it's giving us less and less, and from the other side it is actually introducing ideas that can be used by the socialist movement, ideas, concepts, whatever you want to call it, systems.
Yeah, it's sort of like they're almost digging their own grave. And Carlos, our co-editor, and I would say this all the time during the Bernie campaign. We're like, if these ultra mega or ultra wealthy oligarchs like Bezos and the Walton family who own Walmart were smart, they would let Bernie win, and they would let social democratic policies be implemented. Because after the 40s, at least in the US, we had the largest number of wildcat strikes at any other time in our country's history, and all these labor movements who essentially created what's called the middle class, or the petty bourgeoisie, or even the labor aristocracy, as it's sometimes called. And that's completely disappeared after 40 years of neoliberalism. So now you sort of have an increasing wealth gap, and these corporations who are so big, as you said, they've designed these essentially central planning mechanisms that are designed to increase their profits, but of course could be adjusted to centrally plan the economy as a whole, to make sure that rather than to make sure that Walmart is maximizing their profits, to make sure that everybody is getting what they need to survive. Which is something that Paul Cockshott lays out in his Towards a New Socialism, which I recommend people read. But yeah, it's like they're digging their own grave. And then I'm reading Capital for my second time here. I'm almost finished with it. And you see Marx like predicting.
Same here. The pain, man. It's a fucking pain. Yes, please continue.
It is, but it's very illuminating. Like you were saying,
it is.
The Marxist analysis is the only thing that's scientific, or the closest thing we have to a scientific analysis of society. And it makes things so much easier. Like when you look at the rise of right-wing populism with Donald Trump in the US, and then you look at what's going on in Europe, where all this right-wing populism is becoming popular, and all this anti-immigrant sentiment. If you look at the Marxist analysis, it's like, you could have predicted this. When when the wealth gap becomes so intense, and when power and wealth and capital becomes so concentrated at the top, and you have a working class who doesn't have the Marxist analysis, who doesn't have an idea of how they can materially improve their lives, people are susceptible to right-wing populism. And when someone like Donald Trump comes along and says the immigrants are taking all your jobs, I'm going to bring them back and end the wars, you have a lot of working people who are like, all right, sounds good to me, because I know the Democrats aren't going to do anything for me. I know the liberal parties aren't going to do anything for me. So they're susceptible to this right-wing populism. But the only way to improve their lives is worker organization, and then, you know, to actually change the relations of production, to seize Walmart and to seize the capital of the capitalists, their position of control in society, and also, as we were saying, this technical ability that they've developed on their own to plan the economy and to move to new property relations, and better relations of society. And again, talking about Marx's materialist scientific analysis, this is something he was very clear about, like feudalism or Southern slavery in the US. These modes of production prior to capitalism furnished the technology that allowed capitalism to become the dominant system. And now you see the same sort of thing happening, where as Walmart is increasing the amount of wealth they have in comparison to the working class and in comparison to the people who consume their goods, they're also creating the technology that we need to move to new property relations, where Walmart, at least the people who own Walmart, are completely useless.
Exactly. Though there's a bit of a difference between the periods in which feudalism developed to a certain extent, after which we slowly moved into bourgeois society and into capitalism, and also, you know, the point that capitalism eventually, inevitably, will have to evolve into another system or turn to complete barbarism. We don't really have time to wait for eventually. And that's because obviously we live on a finite planet and resources are running out, and the planet is literally dying. Not the planet is dying, but the planet will eventually get rid of us in order to continue its millennial existence. So it falls down to socialists like yourself, like myself, all over the world, to speed up the process through which capitalism decays as much as possible. And no, I'm not making some sort of accelerationist point here. All I'm trying to say is that it's no longer even a question of socialism or barbarism. It is literally the question of socialism or death. And I don't know if you've seen, but the massive wildfires in Central Africa and Eastern Europe right now, in the country where I'm at, like half of it is literally on fire. What we've seen in LA, what we've seen in Australia happen, it's also currently happening in South America, is kind of bringing this global crisis to people's literal front doors. It was really funny to watch. I mean, it wasn't funny. It was a horrible event. What happened in Germany, I don't know if you heard, there was a massive flood and literally hundreds of people died. And a lot of the Germans that they were interviewing, their first reaction was like, I'm used to seeing this happen in Asia, but 300 people dying in Germany from a flood? I can't believe this is happening. What am I trying to say with this whole thing? It's that the most privileged and in many cases absolutely imperialist powers are slowly starting to see the consequences which a lot of people in the global south have been living for literal decades. And I hope it will wake up people and push them more towards the left than it will to the right. But we can definitely expect, as you said, the right-wing populism to even grow further and further, because it is going to be fueled further and further by more and more problems, which will obviously be blamed on different minority groups, foreigners, other countries, etc., etc. This combined with the obviously slowly bubbling new Cold War, which is very directly pointed towards China, is pretty much going to give a lot of ammunition to right-wingers very easily to define problems from their perspective, which unfortunately the left as a scientific methodology cannot afford to. So that is why it's extremely important for us to, yes, when we are discussing, and probably a lot of people already watching this are already socialists, et cetera, we can dive into, more detailed stuff without, using layman's terms. But for a lot of people, if we genuinely want socialism to develop as an adequate both movement and option for the future, the everyday man, the actual working class, the proletariat, needs to be recruited faster and better than the right recruits. And unfortunately, right now, the right, at least in the West, is absolutely kicking our fucking ass. But I have a lot of hope in newer generations, which thankfully are getting, let's just call it, I don't know, a better education system than what existed before, and are coming to much wiser conclusions than their forefathers and foremothers, et cetera. But history will tell. We will see where it goes. There are currently existing, at least from my perspective, some might disagree, and that's absolutely okay. There are currently existing socialist experiments that are going to show if they're in it for the long run eventually, or, they will obviously potentially betray the revolution or whatever. We need to have hope in them, but we also need to be building the movement at home, because for every single person that we do not turn into a socialist, they will eventually become a right winger. Why? Because again, the world is fucking dying, problems are going to be increasing rapidly, and there is not going to be such a thing as a centrist in 30-40 years, trust me.
True. And the Trump transportation administration published what Chomsky, and I'm not the biggest Chomsky fan, but what he called the most shocking document in human history, where they said essentially the world is heating up so fast that there's not much we can do to stop it without radically transforming society. So therefore, who cares? We're just going to take off all regulations and just keep going. And obviously that kind of illustrates how dire the situation is. Again, not to sound like an accelerationist or a Malthusianist, but there have been in a large number of climate-induced storms or tropical storms and wildfires, things like that this year. And scientists are telling us this is because of increased heating. So it comes to what Rosa Luxemburg said, like you were saying, socialism or barbarism, or even socialism, or the complete destruction of the planet. And I'm thinking of recently, or just a few days ago, Vijay Prashad went to the book talk, or the book release of David Harvey's most recent book. And David Harvey essentially said two things. He said there's no such thing as imperialism anymore, or imperialism is too broad a word to describe what the US does. And that, there's no moving to socialism because capitalism has grown too big to fail and too powerful to fail. And Vijay critiques him, one, saying, hey, David Harvey, you live on the other side of imperialism, so it's easy for you to say imperialism doesn't exist living in the West. And then this idea that capitalism's too big to fail, as we were talking about, one, capitalism is increasing its inequality as it destroys the planet, so that's going to increase, revolutionary fervor. And then for someone like me, who's just getting into Marxism in my 20s, this might sound cocky or arrogant, but, I've amassed a large following on TikTok, and Midwestern Marxism amassed a large following of class conscious people because of hard work that we've put in, hard work trying to reach people, hard work trying to win, trying to defeat the capitalist class as the working class. And when I hear people like David Harvey, who have been around for 80 years and have left the world in this neoliberal state where, the planet is being destroyed, I think David Harvey is a great academic, but I don't really want to hear this nonsense about how there can't be socialism because capitalism's too big. Because I want to be able to have children, David Harvey, and I want to be able to have a sustainable planet for the generations that follow me. And when I hear Western academics who are comfortably paid and in a comfortable position being like, yeah, I like Marxism because it allows us to analyze things like climate or the climate crisis, I just don't think we can do anything about it, right? I don't think we can move to socialism out of capitalism. It's like, I don't want to hear that, one. And two, if people were putting in the hard work of actually trying to win and actually trying to reach people, rather than just taking comfortable positions in academia, maybe we could win, maybe we could organize the working class to stop the planet from being destroyed. So I get really frustrated, especially with Western academics. And the thing I have no tolerance for at this point in my life while we're facing the climate crisis is post-leftism. This idea that we can never escape capitalism and we might as well give up. I don't want to hear it. I think that's pessimistic. And, maybe we don't have a chance to win, but I'll tell you what, we absolutely have no chance to win if our leaders are telling us we have no chance to win, right? If the main people who people follow and look to for advice on Marxism are telling us that socialism is impossible, that's ridiculous, and it's basically condemning the world to being destroyed. So I really, Vijay Prashad went and told off David Harvey about that at his book launch while wearing a Lenin shirt. So I thought that
Nice.
was awesome, and a critique that needs to be made right now.
Absolutely. I mean, nothing happens for decades and then the world can change in a matter of weeks. Obviously, I butchered that quote. But it is exceedingly depressing to see nihilism come from the perspective of people who self-identify as Marxists, because at the end of the day, yes, sure, even if you are having, you know, a pessimist streak in your life and in your analysis of the world, as a materialist, you should understand that sharing your opinion, which is again extremely negative, with potentially revolutionary young people and mid adults, will do nothing but quite literally hurt the movement. So put easily, he should have just kept his mouth shut and kept his opinion for himself, because that sort of opinion literally does nothing except fuel more power towards capitalist analysts, journalists, etc., who can overexploit and continuously point to the specific academic as a massive critic of this or that. I mean, that kind of even happened with Trotsky to one extent, but that's a conversation that would probably take 7 podcasts on the podcast episodes on themselves. But yes, and there's this new thing, I mean, a relatively new thing, which is pretty much the commodification of absolutely everything. And to one extent, I notice with a lot of Western comrades that they've kind of commodified even the identity of being a Marxist, and they use it as this sort of shield against any sort of action that they might need to actually partake in order to change the world. What am I trying to say? A lot of people think that it's absolutely enough to just call yourself a Marxist. Well, I'm sorry, but Marxism is not a religion, and it's not just about belief. It is about acting in the material world and trying to instill class consciousness in others, and eventually lead towards a better material state for the working class. Therefore, commodifying it and just using it as oh, I am a Marxist in the same way, I don't know, people like to say, oh, I only eat organic chocolate and I only buy locally, is not the way to go, because it quite sadly completely demotivates you in a way, because you tell yourself, okay, look at all of these normies everywhere that are absolutely not doing anything, that probably don't even know who Marx is, but me, smart man, understands how capitalism is fucked up and what needs to be done, and because I understand, I've already done enough for the movement. So that's a whole thing which expands into movies, books, etc., where we, for example, fantastic film like Parasite, I don't know if you've watched it, fantastic piece of cinematography, extremely class conscious, etc., but after I watched it, I didn't feel like working on any of my videos or talking to people about Marxism for the next 2 weeks, because I already got the gratuity, from just watching this thing and saying, oh my God, I am such a class conscious individual, watching class conscious movies, talking to people about about Marxism. That's where all my activism, quote unquote, all my revolutionary activity, quote unquote, finishes. And it's kind of a dangerous thing, especially with, for example, stuff that we do. I mean, you make TikToks, you also make YouTube videos, you do the podcast, I make my YouTube videos, I do Twitter or whatever. At one moment, we are risking the very real issue, which is we might be creating and overextending with our videos to such an extent that, yes, it might radicalize a lot of people, but those already radicalized, it might turn them into, kind of sleeping giants that feel like everything that they need to do this week when it comes to Marxism is, watch Yugopnik or watch, Midwestern Marx. And it's an interesting thing that is developing. I don't know what your opinion is, but to me, it's kind of scary, to be honest.
Yes, I've noticed it 100%. The way I've been describing it is I say Marxism is becoming a trend in the West. So my friend actually sent me a tweet this morning. It was like someone was amazed by the amount of people who will say they've read a book and then haven't read the book. But now because Marxism is a trend, it's cool to say I've read Capital. It's cool to say I've read all these theory or these books of theory. And you kind of feel dumb or less, you lose part of that superiority complex that a lot
I have a theory that nobody has ever read Capital. Absolutely nobody has ever read. I'm kidding. Yes, please continue.
Dude, I write that in my notes all the time as I'm making my way through it. I'm like, nobody's ever read this. Nobody ever talks about this. But, and it's
How
like,
many rolls of linen?
Right? And it's like, so then if people are claiming that they've read books of theory when they really haven't, what is the purpose of reading theory to people? Is it to change the world? Is it because they believe in these books of theory? There's a scientific analysis of the system we're living in, and by learning it, that it's going to be easier to change the system? Or are you trying to read through books fast so you can brag about it online? And it's something definitely with the online culture. And another thing I've noticed is, and obviously I probably am overexposed to this side of leftism that we're talking about right now, or Marxism, because I spend so much time on TikTok, which is a lot of kids. But there's people who are like there were people for a while attacking me, people who call themselves Marxists, because they said I was recruiting too many conservatives to Marxism, or I was recruiting too many people who didn't have the appropriate views, or they had some backwards views. And I'm like, again, with that, I'm like, okay, so is Marxism a trend where we all get together and we act like we're the smartest, most morally correct people ever? Or is it, an ideology where we try and win the working class and draw them away from their backwards views, and show them how they can, through class struggle, can materially advance, their conditions and change society for the better? So yeah, I see definitely an increase in people who just like to put Marx in their Twitter bio. And then, on top of that, I'm constantly saying, I'm assuming that everybody I'm talking to is also organizing in their community, right? Because it's not enough, as you said, just to watch TikTok or YouTube videos and be like, okay, I'm a Marxist now. And I'm seeing it again. I recently put up, or we donated $100, and we're trying to organize people to show solidarity with these Alabama coal miners who have been striking for 4 months. And there are all these comments like, coal is bad for the environment, or don't these workers in Alabama vote Republican? And I'm like, that doesn't mean you don't show solidarity with the coal miners, right? One, it's not the climate crisis is not their fault. And two, they're showing class solidarity and advancing class struggle. You shouldn't back away from that and look at that as useless because the state that they live in voted Republican. So yeah, lots of negative things that I see in this trend of Marxism becoming sort of a social trend.
How dare you help someone if they don't drive a Prius? I mean, if we start digging into every single working class person's biography, we're gonna find some shit there, no matter who we look at, because literally nobody is a saint. So we need to kind of understand that this is a mass movement which necessitates pretty much at least 51% of the working class to be on its side. So there's going to be a lot of people that kick dogs in this movement. There's going to be a lot of people that stalk women online. There's going to be a lot of shitty motherfuckers who are unfortunately still a member of the working class and who will, again, unfortunately, be necessary in its struggle and in its development and growth. And yes, ex-conservatives are one of those. A lot of even ex-fascists make some of the most radical socialists afterwards, even though a lot of ex-socialists make very radical fascists. But yeah, so this just the whole discussion of who we should try and recruit and who we should not try and recruit is not a materialist analysis. That just playing with liberal moralism, which has absolutely no place in kind of the world we are trying to create at the end of the day. I mean, Marxism is looking at the labor relations between people in a given society, and then it proposes a way through which we can change those labor relations so that they are better for the people who are actually creating that shit, so that the world can develop to an extent and to a level in which, you know, no hierarchy, no class, no money, etc., etc. But to get there, we're not, it is not a pursuit of, oh, capitalist man, bad, immoral, that is why I fight capitalist man. No, capitalist man is doing what he needs to do in capitalist society in order to live better, because nobody wants to live like a pro. It is the system which needs to be rooted out and changed based on material analysis, and not, again, I'm sorry for repeating myself, but I want to like plug this into people's heads, not just petty morality of man A good, man B bad, so we should be with man A. Oh, those guys are digging coal, therefore we should fucking forget about every single one of them. Oh, that person, I don't know, eats a lot of dairy, ruining the planet, we should get rid of them. Oh, that guy drives a truck that, I don't know, you Americans, fuck, your cars spend too much, but okay, that's it's a different thing, like 50 gallons per 100 kilometers. 50 miles. If we really want to start and push people away from our movement, I think we will end up pushing even ourselves away. So this is not what should be preoccupying our minds at this stage of developing the socialist movement in general. It's even very silly and cringe to me, but yeah.
It is. Yeah, we've been calling it bourgeois sentimentalism kind of in my groups. Kind of this idea that, you know, Marxism is when I move the farthest left. So I have the most moral and correct positions on anything, and anybody who doesn't take my morally correct positions is therefore wrong. It's like, no, that is
Marxist.
What's that?
I'm sorry for the Sigma Marxist.
Sigma Marxist.
You're not an alpha beta, you're a Sigma Marxist. So Marxist, you don't want to do anything. Oh.
That's so funny. A Sigma Marxist is a Marxist who's so Marxist they don't interact with their community at all. They've completely transcended above their community. No, it's like we're saying Marxism is scientific. So at the relations of production, you have the capitalist class who owns and the working class who doesn't. So you could have the nicest banker in the world, you know, who owns 20 banks in your town. He could be a nice guy, but because of his relations to the means of production, he's still maintaining the horrendous, murderous, imperialistic, unequal system. Versus you could have someone, you know, a worker who works for a company that gets financed by that bank, who's kind of an asshole, but, you know, he's willing to strike and he's willing to fight for the working class. And as a Marxist, you know, that worker who's kind of an asshole is much more useful to us than the banker who seems like a really nice guy. And, you know, nobody's saying let's throw, you know, workers who have anti-immigrant racist positions like into positions of power in all our movements. But like you said, you know, a lot of people, because the capitalists own the media and the news, a lot of the working class is indoctrinated with backwards views. And once they get around people struggling for socialism, a lot of those views tend to, you know, they tend to work through them in their brains, which is the dialectical view that people are capable of change. And yeah, I mean, it's just the worst thing you can do to just write people off because you feel that you're morally superior to them, I believe.
Absolutely on point.
For sure. I want to ask maybe one more question here. Looks like we've been going for about 45 minutes. But what
it passed really quick.
It did. We've been having a good conversation here. So one more question. I'm always talking about things that are specific to the United States and specific to our struggle for socialism. And even more than that, we focus on the Midwest. That's why we're Midwestern Marx. But in your area, what are some specific things you see maybe as issues or specific things that you would like to see the working class doing to advance class struggle? Or yeah, just talk about some of the specific conditions to your area so we can inform some of our audience here.
Sure thing. So for whoever's listening who doesn't know me, I am from the Balkan Peninsula, which is southeastern Europe pretty much, where there was this beautiful socialist internationalist experiment called Yugoslavia, which collapsed in bloody, murderous chaos during the 90s. So when it comes to the left in regions where the socialist movement had fallen, if we can use that term, we have a very specific political environment in which any talk of even the slightest of left-wing politics or introduction of said left-wing politics into the mainstream is completely ostracized, seen as authoritarian, and looked down upon both by centrist liberals as well as conservatives and obviously fascists. As Yugoslavia was falling apart during the 90s, and not only Yugoslavia but the wider, but also the Warsaw Pact countries, Soviet allies, for those who don't know, a lot of Western capital, political capital, was welcomed in those specific regions, specifically targeted at creating center-right or even far-right parties, which will populate the parliaments and not allow the Socialist or Communist Party to re-establish itself and get back into parliament through now new parliamentary elections. So what this did is move incredible funds, in a lot of information, a lot of free PR towards right-wing parties, towards right-wing ideas, towards free market ideology, towards embracing capitalism as this new sun which will dawn upon us after we have suffered for so long in under the disgusting reds, etc., which after 30 years at this point has implanted itself so hard in the minds of the absolute majority of people living in this part of the world, that you have this extremely ironic situation that the flag bearers of the revolution, the nations and peoples which were one of the first ones to fight for this glorious idea, of course they had their faults, of course they did some phenomenal things, etc., but it's extremely sad to see that they are now, I would argue, places which are going to see the socialist revolution last, because of all of the factors which I previously pointed out. I mean, it's so messed up to an extent that even parties that still to this day have the word socialist in their name and that have inherited, yes, sure, some bad stuff, but a lot of good stuff from the previous main and only communist party, are now only socialist in name. And I'm not saying that like for the analysis of Democrats in the US, oh, they're not really progressive, they're just the same as the Republicans. No, I'm saying they are really not socialist to such an extent that they share 100% of the same policies as their center-right or even far-right colleagues, some very often sharing in extremely homophobic, anti-immigrant rhetoric, etc., So the situation is very dire for the movement, though I see young people kind of starting to question the Western idea of what it was like to live in these places. And I see a lot of younger people actually talking to their grandparents and parents about, was it really bad? And actually starting to listen to them when their parents and grandparents talk. So they are starting to realize, that 20th century socialism was not as bad as people from Burgerlandia say it was, but also they become more and more people who potentially will want to build, socialism in the future in the local regions. That is the only people I have kind of some hope in, but in general, unfortunately, the situation in Central and Southeastern Europe in all these beautiful, beautiful Slavic countries is in a very, very dire situation.
That's fascinating, and it's fascinating too. We recently, or I recently got into a back and forth about Yugoslavia, and I got the chance to talk to a lot of people who lived in the former Yugoslavia. And as you said, a lot of the older people who were there, especially pre-90s, speak highly of it, and they talk about how much better it was back then as far as an economic system versus now. But I guess I want to get your opinion. It might seem a little petty, but this is the recent discussion we got in. So a writer from our website in the youth league tweeted, Yugoslavia was a multi-ethnic socialist state, and Bernie voted for the NATO bombing of it. Obviously, as you said, what was going on in the 90s was probably, a lot more complex than that. Than just to say, it was a multi-ethnic socialist state, and then Bernie voted for this bombing and it went away. Obviously, there was, years of attempted IMF and World Bank infiltration, various things going on the ground, which maybe you can provide some more insight to here. But essentially, another DSA styles, sort of social democrat type socialist, called out Midwestern Marx for liking that tweet and said that the worst trend in the American left right now is people who will praise any country who's anti-American, or people who will give solidarity to any movement just because they're opposed to the US. And he said that our liking that tweet was an example of that. So in my response, basically I said, Yugoslavia was building socialism. Obviously, in the 90s, things got pretty crazy, but a lot of that was due to Western influence. And I think it's a worse trend to see socialists or people on the left promoting regime change propaganda because of things they disagree with going on in various countries like China or the DPRK, rather than saying, maybe we have our critiques of these countries, but we stand in solidarity with them. And of course, we stand against Western regime change. So I guess what would be your takeaway from that, or how would you respond, or do you have any analysis of that back and forth I had, I guess?
I mean, okay, so from one perspective, I have like the bombs that Bernie voted for literally dropped on the top of my head multiple times in that period. But thank God I was very, very young, so I don't remember most of it. Still, was it a necessary military move at that point in order to stop potential additional crimes being committed over a certain ethnic group or the other? It's a question that, I don't know, military analysts can go into, etc., etc. But for me, as a Marxist and an anti-imperialist, I see the bombing of Yugoslavia as one of the first modern experiments that the US kind of put forth to see how their local population will react to this new style of interventionism, which later peaked in Iraq and so on and so on. That whole war, while it was going on, was between very far right individual states cut on tribal, on the lines of tribal belonging, killing each other like absolute animals for sometimes good reasons, but usually for absolutely horrific reasons. So the intervention there was not necessarily an intervention against a leftist or a socialist country. So that there should be a distinction between, for example, an intervention in Bolivia, which has, a social democratic government, etc., and an intervention in, I don't know, current, I don't know, Brazil, fascist Brazil. But this does not mean that either of those should be encouraged, because all data shows that at the end of the day, they do not bring any sort of solution to the local problems, and only work to heighten the tension and make the flames rise even higher. So just put in one sentence, military violent interventions don't work 99% of the time, and when they're being done by the state which represents and protects the interests of capitalism and capitalists, then you should be even more additionally skeptical of it than any other state.
Interesting. Yeah, I'm happy to hear your answer on that. I knew you would provide some interesting context. That's super interesting that you were near the bombings, or they were dropped. Um, did you say they were dropped on top of a building you were in?
I mean, I was in the country while it was being bombed. The city I was in was very, very, very heavily targeted during the bombing campaign. But it's very sad that probably for a lot of people from all walks of life and from all corners of the world, to probably hear words coming out of a Frenchman's or an Englishman's or an American's mouth, that the violence they experienced on their own skin was necessary because we were saving you from X, Y, or Z. So you were saving me and yet you were hurting me. That kind of sounds like an abusive husband. And I don't think anybody wants an abusive husband or wife.
Right. Yes, that's a good way of putting it. Actually, I want to ask one more question here, and it's kind of a broad question, but you don't have to go too in depth if you don't want. But I have not studied former Yugoslavia as intensely as I've studied a lot of other countries. I know a little bit about Tito, but it's one of the most common questions I'm asked. I think on the Wikipedia page for Marxism, one of the sects of Marxism that they put is Titoism. So I'm pretty sure when kids go research Marxism on Wikipedia, they read Titoism and then they come to me and they say, "What are your thoughts on Tito?" And I'm not totally sure, but what are your thoughts on the original struggle for socialism in Yugoslavia and the policies implemented under Tito?
So Tito was a Giga Mega Chad who lived in a cave during World War II, and during the biggest conflict that has ever existed, managed to not only defeat the Nazis, but also create a new internationalist, very important internationalist socialist project in the middle of one of the most divided parts of the world, which just, I don't know, 100 years before liberated itself from Ottoman imperialism. So just that feat on its own, to me, is absolutely incredible. People distancing, for example, calling it Titoism, I think that's similar to, people just using whatever name, Trotskyism, Stalinism, etc., and they create. And if you do that, you can create 5 million additional ideologies. Did Yugoslavia have a different approach than the Soviet Union did when it comes to organizing, work, labor, industry, etc., inside of Yugoslavia itself? Yes, it has. It would take 2 hours just to discuss the positives and negatives of it. It worked for a very long time for Yugoslavia, and that at one moment, the contradictions which this sort of so-called worker self-management introduced did end up hurting the economy massively. IMF loans were taken. That was probably a strategically bad move, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into it too much, but my opinions on Tito are that he was an absolute hero of our people in our region. And my opinion on Yugoslavia is that in the Balkan Peninsula, life standards, sovereignty, levels of education, rights for women, lack of conflict, lack of crime, quite literally freedom of movement has never reached the height which it reached during Yugoslavia.
Huh. That is fascinating, especially to hear it from someone from the area when I've been discussing this with a lot of Americans lately. So this is very helpful, and hopefully it'll be helpful for our audience too. So yeah, we've been going for about an hour now. That's usually where we cut it off, but do you have anything else you'd like to discuss before we end it here?
No, this was absolutely lovely. I can't believe an hour passed, to be honest. I would love to do this again at some point. I sometimes live stream on my channel as well. Maybe you can jump in whenever you find the time. And yeah, thank you for your time. And these were pretty cool topics. It flew very smoothly.
Yeah, you bet. Yeah, it was a great conversation. So hopefully I will be able to hop in some of your live streams. I'll stay tuned there. Do you have anything you want to promote before we head out? Yugopnik on YouTube, right?
Yes, Yugopnik on YouTube, Yugopnik on Twitter. Check me out. I make pragmatic analysis videos of capitalism, socialism, and sometimes fascism. Check me out and have a good one.
Yeah, you bet. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for being with us, Yugopnik.
Thank you.